I was standing in the grocery store checkout line when my phone buzzed with the notification that would change everything. My 22-year-old daughter Melissa had just posted a video titled, "My Mom Has Completely Lost It, Family Drama Exposed," and it already had 3,000 views. In that moment, watching strangers in the comments section tear apart my parenting while she painted herself as the victim, I had no idea that within 72 hours, she would lose access to the $2 million trust fund her grandfather had left her. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Dora Jenkins, and for the past 3 years, I've been fighting a battle I never thought I'd have to fight. The battle to save my own daughter from herself. It started small, like these things always do. Little lies about where she was going, money disappearing from my purse, friends who seemed more interested in what she could buy them than who she actually was as a person. But it escalated into something I couldn't have imagined when I first held that tiny baby in my arms 22 years ago. The grocery store incident happened on a Tuesday afternoon in October. I'd been having lunch with my sister Rebecca when Melissa called, her voice shaking with what I thought was genuine distress. She said her car had broken down on the highway outside Portland, and she needed $800 immediately for repairs. She couldn't wait for AAA, she said, because she had a job interview the next morning that could change her entire future. Her voice cracked when she talked about how this was her big break, how she'd finally found a company that valued her marketing degree. I should have known better. God knows I'd heard variations of this story dozens of times over the past year. But something in her voice made me want to believe that this time was different, that maybe she really had turned a corner. So I drove to the nearest bank, withdrew the money, and sent it to her through one of those instant transfer apps. I even added an extra $200 for food and gas, telling myself that supporting your children sometimes meant taking risks on them. That was my first mistake. The second mistake was believing her when she called 2 hours later, sobbing so hard I could barely understand her words. She said the repair shop was demanding an additional $1,200 because they'd found more damage than initially expected. She said the car was completely undrivable without the extra work, and she was stranded at some roadside motel with nowhere to go. She begged me not to let her sleep in her car, painted a picture of herself as this vulnerable young woman surrounded by strangers in a dangerous area. I sent the money. By Thursday morning, I was getting calls from 3 different credit card companies, asking about unusual charges on accounts linked to my daughter's emergency contact information. Apparently, she'd been using my name and credit history to open store cards at high-end retailers throughout the city. When I called the phone number she'd given me for the motel, the desk clerk had never heard of anyone named Melissa Jenkins. When I tried tracking the location she'd sent me through GPS, it led to an empty parking lot behind a strip mall. That's when I realized my daughter hadn't just lied to me. She'd orchestrated an elaborate con game, complete with fake addresses and fabricated emergencies, all designed to extract as much money from me as possible. The car breakdown, the job interview, the dangerous motel situation, none of it was real. What was real was the $1,500 missing from my account and the growing pile of credit card bills arriving in my mailbox. I'd been working as a high school guidance counselor for 18 years, helping teenagers navigate everything from college applications to family crises. I thought I understood manipulation, thought I could spot the warning signs of someone trying to take advantage of trust. But when it's your own child, when it's someone you've loved and protected and sacrificed for since the day they were born, the warning signs look different. They look like love letters asking for help. The confrontation happened on a Saturday morning when Melissa finally came home. She walked through the front door of my small ranch house in Beaverton like nothing had happened, carrying shopping bags from stores I couldn't afford to browse in, wearing a leather jacket that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. Her hair had been professionally colored and styled, and she was wearing makeup that looked like it had been applied by someone who knew what they were doing. She looked beautiful and confident, and completely unbothered by the financial chaos she'd left in her wake. I was sitting at the kitchen table with the credit card statements spread out in front of me, trying to calculate exactly how much debt she'd managed to accumulate in my name over the past 6 months. When she saw the papers, her face didn't change. She just set her shopping bags down on the counter and started making herself a cup of coffee like this was any other weekend morning. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. She shrugged without turning around. "Sure, what's up?" "What's up is that you've been lying to me for months. What's up is that I just spent my morning on the phone with creditors, trying to figure out how my daughter managed to open 4 different store credit cards, using my personal information. What's up is that you took $1,500 from me under completely false pretenses and then disappeared for 3 days." She turned around then, and the expression on her face wasn't shame or guilt or even surprise. It was annoyance, like I was interrupting something more important she had planned for the day. "Mom? You're being dramatic. I paid you back." "You haven't paid me back anything. I bought you that wine you like from Whole Foods. It's in the fridge." I stared at her, trying to process the disconnect between a $1,500 theft and a $30 bottle of wine. "Melissa, that's not paying me back. That's not even close to paying me back." She rolled her eyes and pulled out her phone, her fingers moving quickly across the screen. "Fine. I'll Venmo you right now." God, you act like I'm some kind of criminal. But when she held up the phone to show me the transfer screen, the amount she'd entered was $50. "Are you serious right now?" I asked. "What?" "That's all the cash I have available today. I'll send you more next week when my direct deposit hits." I looked at this person who shared my DNA, who had my eyes and her father's stubborn chin, who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms and make me elaborate birthday cards out of construction paper and glitter. I looked at her and realized I was talking to a stranger. Somewhere along the way, the sweet, creative little girl who used to help me bake cookies for her teachers had been replaced by someone who thought a $50 payment was reasonable restitution for a $1,500 theft. "What direct deposit?" I asked. "You don't have a job. I do freelance social media consulting." "For who?" "Various clients. You wouldn't know them." The vagueness of her answers should have been another red flag. But I was still operating under the assumption that we were having a normal mother-daughter disagreement that could be resolved through honest conversation. I thought if I just explained the financial strain her actions had caused, if I helped her understand how credit and debt actually worked, she would recognize the seriousness of the situation and commit to making things right. I was wrong about that too. Over the next hour, I walked her through every fraudulent charge, every forged application, every instance where she'd used my name and credit history without permission. I showed her the statements, read her the phone conversations I'd had with creditors, explained that her actions weren't just affecting her future, but mine as well. I told her about the late fees and interest charges that were accumulating daily, about how my credit score was dropping because of accounts I hadn't even known existed. She listened with the patient expression of someone humoring a boring story, occasionally checking her phone or examining her manicure. When I finished, she looked up and said, "Okay, but what do you want me to do about it? I can't exactly travel back in time. I want you to take responsibility. I want you to contact these companies and explain that you open these accounts without authorization. I want you to work out payment plans for the existing debt. I want you to understand that what you did was theft, and that theft has consequences." She laughed then, actually laughed, like I just told her the most ridiculous joke she'd ever heard. "Mom, you're being so extra right now. These companies have insurance for this stuff. They're not exactly hurting for money. And besides, you can just call them and explain that there was a misunderstanding. They'll probably just write it off." I felt something cold settle in my stomach as I realized that my daughter genuinely believed she was the victim in this situation. She had convinced herself that her actions were justified, that the consequences were unfair, that somehow the adult world owed her a pass because she was young and figuring things out. She wasn't taking responsibility because she didn't believe she needed to. "Melissa, this isn't a misunderstanding. This is fraud. And the companies aren't just going to write off several $1,000s in debt because I asked them nicely." "Well, what do you want me to do? I don't have that kind of money." "I want you to get a job, a real job with regular hours and steady pay. I want you to make monthly payments until every penny is paid back. I want you to understand that actions have consequences." She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the linoleum floor. "You know what? I don't need to listen to this. I am an adult, and you can't control what I do anymore. You're right, you are an adult. Which means you're responsible for your own debts and your own choices. Which also means that if you want to continue living in this house, you need to follow some basic rules about honesty and respect. Are you seriously threatening to kick me out right now? I'm telling you that I love you, but I can't enable this behavior anymore. I can't keep pretending that lying and stealing are acceptable as long as you're family. She stared at me for a long moment, and I thought maybe I was finally getting through to her. Maybe the reality of potential consequences was enough to break through whatever defense mechanisms she'd built up around her actions.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Maybe this could be the conversation that turned everything around. Instead, she picked up her purse and headed for the door. This is insane. I'm going to stay with Jessica until you calm down and start acting like a normal mom again. She left that day, and I didn't hear from her for 2 weeks. No phone calls, no text messages, no way to know if she was safe or fed, or making any effort to address the financial mess she'd created. I called Jessica's mother, who told me that Melissa had never shown up there. I called her other friends, most of whom claimed they hadn't seen her in months. I even filed a missing person report, though the police explained that since she was an adult who had left voluntarily, there wasn't much they could do unless there was evidence of foul play. During those 2 weeks, I had plenty of time to think about where I'd gone wrong as a parent. I replayed conversations, analyzed decisions, wondered if I'd been too permissive or too strict, too involved or too distant. I questioned every choice I'd made since her father died when she was 16. Wondered if my grief had made me too lenient with her behavior, too eager to avoid conflict during an already difficult time. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that this wasn't about my parenting failures. This was about a young woman who had learned to manipulate people's love for her as a way to avoid facing the natural consequences of her choices. And as long as I kept rescuing her from those consequences, she would never have any reason to change. When she finally came home, it was because she needed something. She walked through the front door on a Thursday evening like she'd just been out running errands, dropped her purse on the counter, and started rummaging through the refrigerator. "Hey," she said casually, not looking at me. "I'm starving. Did you make dinner?" I was sitting in the living room, reading a book about boundaries and difficult family relationships that my sister had recommended. I set it down and looked at my daughter, really looked at her. She'd lost weight during the 2 weeks she'd been gone, and her clothes looked like she'd been sleeping in them. Her hair was greasy and pulled back in a messy ponytail, and she had dark circles under her eyes that makeup couldn't quite cover. "Where have you been?" I asked. "Around. Staying with friends. You know." "I called your friends. None of them had seen you." She shrugged. "I have friends you don't know about." "Are you okay? Are you safe?" For just a moment, her mask slipped and I saw something vulnerable flash across her face. But she recovered quickly, turning back to the refrigerator and emerging with leftover pizza. "I'm fine." "Stop being so paranoid." I watched her heat up the pizza in the microwave, her movements quick and efficient, like she was trying to get through this interaction as fast as possible. When the timer beeped, she grabbed the plate and started heading toward the stairs. "Melissa, wait." She stopped but didn't turn around. "We still need to talk about what happened before you left. About the credit cards and the money and how we're going to fix this situation." "God, Mom, you're still hung up on that? I told you I'd pay you back." "When? How? You don't have a job or any source of income that I'm aware of." She turned around then, and the expression on her face was hard in a way that reminded me of her father when he was angry. "Actually, I do have income. I've been making money through social media, sponsored posts, affiliate marketing, that kind of thing. I'm basically an influencer now." I had seen her Instagram account, which had maybe 300 followers and consisted mainly of selfies and pictures of food. The idea that she was making any significant money through social media seemed unlikely, but I was willing to listen. "Okay, how much money are we talking about?" "Enough to cover my expenses." "What about the debt you created? The credit card bills that are still coming to this house in my name?" She sighed dramatically. "Fine. I'll handle it. But I need you to stop treating me like a child and give me some space to figure things out." "I can give you space, but I also need some concrete steps and timelines." I need to know exactly how you plan to pay back what you owe, and I need to see evidence that you're actually following through. Evidence? What am I, on trial or something? You're a person who has repeatedly lied to me about money. So yes, I need evidence that you're telling the truth now. She stared at me for a long moment, then set her plate down on the counter with enough force that I was surprised it didn't break. You know what? Forget it. I don't need this negativity in my life. I'm trying to build something positive, and all you want to do is drag me down with your trust issues and control problems. Melissa? No, I'm done. I'm done trying to live up to your impossible standards and your constant judgment. I'm 22 years old, and I shouldn't have to justify every decision I make to my mother. She grabbed her purse and headed for the door again, but this time I followed her. If you leave now, don't come back until you're ready to have an honest conversation about taking responsibility for your actions. She turned around in the doorway, her face flushed with anger. Fine. But when I'm successful and living my best life, don't come crying to me about how you pushed away your own daughter because you couldn't handle the fact that she's an independent adult. She slammed the door hard enough that the pictures on the nearby wall rattled, and I stood there listening to her car engine start and fade into the distance. I felt exhausted and heartbroken and completely out of options. I had tried being supportive, I had tried being firm, I had tried reasoning with her and setting boundaries and offering compromises. Nothing worked because she fundamentally didn't believe that the rules applied to her. That night, I called my father. He was 83 years old, sharp as ever, and the only person I knew who might have some perspective on dealing with family members who seemed determined to destroy themselves. He listened without interrupting while I explained everything that had happened over the past few months, from the initial credit card fraud to the most recent confrontation. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Dora, he finally said, do you remember when your brother went through his gambling phase? I did remember. My younger brother Marcus had developed a serious gambling addiction in his 30s, losing his house, his marriage, and nearly his relationship with the entire family before finally getting help. But I wasn't sure what that had to do with Melissa's situation. Marcus was sick, I said. He had an addiction. Melissa is just being selfish and irresponsible. Maybe? Or maybe she's addicted to something too. Maybe she's addicted to the feeling of getting something for nothing, or the rush of manipulating people into giving her what she wants. The specific substance doesn't matter as much as the pattern of behavior. I hadn't thought about it that way before, but it made a disturbing amount of sense. The lies, the manipulation, the complete inability to accept responsibility for consequences, it all fit the pattern of addictive behavior. And just like with Marcus, my attempts to help were actually enabling her to continue the destructive pattern. So what do? I asked. You stop giving her money. You stop believing her excuses. You stop rescuing her from the consequences of her choices. And most importantly, you stop letting her convince you that you're the problem. But she's my daughter. I can't just abandon her. You're not abandoning her. You're giving her the chance to grow up. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to let them face the reality of their situation without a safety net. After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, thinking about safety nets and enabling, and the difference between helping someone and hurting them. I thought about my grandmother, who had raised 5 children during the Depression and always said that the greatest gift you could give a child was the confidence that they could survive whatever life threw at them. I thought about how my constant rescuing of Melissa had sent her the opposite message, that she was too fragile or incompetent to handle her own problems. I made a decision that night. I wouldn't give her any more money, no matter what story she told me or how desperate she claimed to be. I wouldn't pay her bills or cover her rent or bail her out of whatever trouble she got herself into. I would love her and support her emotionally, but I would stop being her personal ATM. It was one of the hardest decisions I'd ever made, and I had no idea how much harder things were about to get. 3 days later, Melissa posted the video that would change everything. She filmed it in what looked like a coffee shop, her hair perfectly styled and her makeup flawless, wearing clothes that I knew for a fact cost more than most people's weekly paychecks. She looked directly into the camera with tears in her eyes and told the world that her mother had kicked her out of the house for no reason, that I was having some kind of mental breakdown and taking it out on her, that she was struggling to survive because her own family had abandoned her in her time of need. She talked about how she'd always been the responsible one, how she'd tried to help with household expenses, but I'd rejected her contributions because I wanted to maintain control over her life. She described me as manipulative and emotionally abusive, someone who used money as a weapon to keep her from becoming independent. She even cried while talking about how much she missed her father, and how his death had changed me into someone cold and unrecognizable. The video was expertly edited, with dramatic music and strategic cuts that made her story seem completely believable. She included screenshots of text messages that looked like they came from me, full of harsh language and ultimatums, though I was certain I'd never sent anything like that. She showed pictures of herself looking exhausted and overwhelmed, painting a picture of a young woman struggling against an unreasonable and unstable parent. By the time I saw the video, it had already been shared hundreds of times across multiple platforms. The comment section was full of people expressing sympathy for her situation and outrage at my alleged behavior. Strangers were calling me a monster, a narcissist, an unfit mother who should be ashamed of myself for treating my own child so cruelly. Some people were even suggesting that someone should call Adult Protective Services to check on my mental health. I sat in my living room, reading comment after comment from people who knew nothing about the real situation but felt completely confident in their judgment. They saw a beautiful, tearful young woman telling a compelling story about parental abuse, and they believed every word of it. They didn't know about the credit card fraud or the lies or the months of manipulation. They didn't know that the contributions to household expenses, she mentioned, were actually $50 Venmo payments offered as restitution for $1,500 thefts. The worst part wasn't the strangers' comments. The worst part was seeing friends and family members sharing the video with their own expressions of concern and support for Melissa. People I had known for years, people who had watched me raise her as a single mother after her father died, were accepting her version of events without question. My own sister shared it with a caption about how important it was to believe young women when they spoke out about family trauma. I called Rebecca immediately. "Did you actually watch that video before you shared it?" I asked. "Of course I watched it. Dora, I'm worried about you. Melissa seems really scared and hurt, and some of the things she's saying about your behavior lately, none of it is true. Come on, I know you've been stressed since James died, and dealing with a young adult child can be incredibly challenging, but maybe you should consider that your perspective on the situation might be a little skewed right now." I felt something break inside my chest. My own sister, who had listened to me complain about Melissa's behavior for months, who had seen the credit card statements and heard about the lies, was choosing to believe a carefully edited social media video over everything she knew about me as a person. "Rebecca, she stole $1,500 from me. She opened credit cards in my name without permission. She's been lying about everything from where she's living to how she's supporting herself. This video is just another manipulation tactic." "I don't know, Dora. She seemed really genuine in the video. And those text messages she showed, what text messages? I never sent her anything like what she showed in that video." "Maybe you don't remember. You've admitted that you've been drinking more since James died, and grief can affect memory." I hung up on her. I had to, because the alternative was saying things that would permanently damage our relationship. But I felt more alone than I had since the day my husband died. Even my own family was choosing to believe Melissa's lies over my truth. That evening, I got a call from my principal. He had seen the video too, shared by one of the school board members who thought it was concerning that someone in such an unstable mental state was working with vulnerable teenagers. He wasn't firing me, he said, but he thought it might be best if I took some time off while things settled down. Just a week or two, until the social media attention died down and people moved on to the next story. I wanted to explain, to defend myself, to point out that accepting a social media video as evidence of someone's mental state was hardly a reasonable standard for employment decisions. But I also knew that arguing would only make me look more unstable, more like the unhinged mother Melissa had portrayed in her video. So I agreed to take the time off, and I hung up the phone feeling like my entire life was crumbling around me. In the space of 24 hours, I had lost the trust of my family, the respect of my community, and potentially my career. all because my daughter had decided that destroying my reputation was easier than taking responsibility for her own actions. But I had no idea that Melissa had made one crucial mistake in her rush to paint herself as the victim. She had forgotten about the one person who knew the truth about her financial situation and had the power to do something about it. She had forgotten about her grandfather's attorney, who happened to be a very thorough man with a strong dislike for fraud and manipulation. And she had definitely forgotten about the specific clauses in her trust fund that addressed exactly this kind of behavior. I woke up the next morning to 17 missed calls and 43 unread text messages. Most of them were from reporters who had somehow gotten my personal phone number, wanting statements about the allegations in Melissa's video. 3 were from neighbors asking if I needed help with groceries or household tasks, their voices carefully neutral in a way that suggested they thought I might be having some kind of breakdown. 1 was from my dentist's office, canceling my upcoming appointment because they felt it would be inappropriate to continue treating someone under such scrutiny. The message that broke me came from Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman I'd been helping with her grocery shopping every Sunday for the past 2 years since her hip surgery. Her voice was shaky and apologetic, as she explained that her daughter thought it would be best if she found more stable assistance for her weekly errands. She thanked me for everything I'd done and said she hoped I would get the help I needed. I sat on my kitchen floor in my pajamas, listening to that message 3 times before I could fully process what was happening. People who had known me for years, who had seen me volunteer at community events and help neighbors and show up consistently for everyone around me, were now treating me like I was dangerous or unstable. All because a 22-year-old with a smartphone had decided to rewrite history in a way that made her look like the victim. The isolation felt suffocating. I couldn't go to the grocery store without people staring and whispering. I couldn't check my social media accounts without seeing my face attached to posts about toxic parenting and family dysfunction. I couldn't even walk my dog without wondering if the neighbors were watching me through their windows, looking for signs of the instability Melissa had described in her video. By Wednesday, I realized I needed help, but I wasn't sure where to find it. My sister was still convinced that Melissa's version of events was at least partially true. My few close friends were being polite but distant, clearly uncomfortable with the whole situation. The school district had made it clear that my return to work would depend on how quickly the controversy died down. I was sitting in my car outside the public library, trying to work up the courage to go inside where people might recognize me, when my phone rang. The number on the screen was one I didn't recognize, but something about the area code seemed familiar. Ms. Jenkins? This is Harold Morrison from Morrison, Kessler & Associates in Seattle. I represent the estate of your late father-in-law, Robert Jenkins. I felt my chest tighten. My father-in-law had died 3 years earlier, leaving behind a complicated web of business investments and family trusts that I'd never fully understood. James had handled all the financial discussions with the lawyers, and after he died, I'd assumed everything had been settled. I apologize for calling out of the blue, Mr. Morrison continued, but I've become aware of some recent social media activity involving your daughter that may have implications for the trust arrangements Mr. Jenkins established before his death. I'm sorry, what kind of implications? Would it be possible for us to meet in person? I think this conversation would be better suited to a private setting, and there are some documents I'd like to review with you. Something in his tone suggested this wasn't a routine legal matter. I agreed to drive to Seattle the following day, partly because I was curious about what he'd discovered, but mostly because I was desperate to talk to someone who might have a different perspective on my situation. The law offices of Morrison, Kessler & Associates occupied the top 2 floors of a sleek downtown building with views of Elliott Bay. Harold Morrison was a thin, precise man in his 60s who moved with the careful economy of someone who had spent decades dealing with wealthy families and their complicated dynamics. His office was lined with legal books and framed photographs of what appeared to be sailing expeditions. Thank you for making the drive, he said, gesturing for me to sit in one of the leather chairs across from his desk. I want to start by expressing my condolences again for James's death. He was a good man, and I know Robert was very proud of him. I nodded, feeling the familiar ache that came with any mention of my late husband. Thank you. But I have to admit, I'm not sure why you wanted to see me. I thought all of Robert's estate matters were finalized years ago. Mr. Morrison opened a thick file folder and pulled out several documents. Most of them were. But there's one particular trust that has remained active, and recent events have brought some of its provisions into focus. He slid a document across the desk to me. It was dense with legal language, but I could make out Melissa's name highlighted in several places. Robert established a substantial educational and character development trust for Melissa when she was 16. The principal amount is approximately $2.3 million, set to be released in phases starting on her 25th birthday, provided she meets certain behavioral and character criteria outlined in the trust documents. I stared at the paper, trying to process what he was telling me. I had no idea Robert had set up anything like this. James never mentioned a trust fund. That was intentional. Robert believed that knowledge of inherited wealth could be detrimental to a young person's character development. The trust was designed to reward positive life choices rather than simply provide unearned income. Mr. Morrison pulled out another document, this one covered with sticky notes and handwritten annotations. The trust includes very specific language about conduct unbecoming of the family name, fraudulent activity, and public behavior that reflects poorly on the Jenkins legacy. It also empowers the trustee, which is me, to investigate any credible allegations of misconduct, and to modify or revoke the trust based on documented evidence of character deficiencies. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. You've seen Melissa's video. I have. And more importantly, I've seen the response to it. When someone with a substantial inheritance makes public accusations against family members, particularly accusations involving financial impropriety, it triggers automatic review protocols built into the trust language. He opened his laptop and turned it toward me. The screen showed what appeared to be a private investigator's report, complete with bank records, credit reports, and transaction histories spanning the past 18 months. Robert was very thorough in his planning. He anticipated that significant wealth might attract individuals who would try to manipulate or take advantage of his family members. So he built safeguards into all of his trust arrangements, including provisions for professional investigation of any concerning behavior patterns. I scrolled through the report, my hands shaking slightly as I recognized transaction after transaction that Melissa had made using my credit information. The investigator had somehow accessed records that I hadn't even known existed, painting a comprehensive picture of systematic fraud dating back over a year. How did you get all of this information? The trust language includes broad authorization for financial investigation when misconduct is suspected. Your daughter's public allegations triggered a full audit of her financial activities, as well as the activities of anyone she'd made claims about. The investigator was quite thorough. I continued reading, seeing not just the credit card fraud I discovered, but dozens of other incidents I'd known nothing about. Small personal loans taken out in my name, store credit accounts opened using my social security number, even what appeared to be an attempt to refinance my mortgage without my knowledge that had been stopped only because of an alert I'd placed on my credit file years earlier. The most concerning finding, Mr. Morrison said, pulling out another document, is evidence that she's been planning this social media campaign for several weeks. The investigator found draft versions of the video script in her cloud storage, along with edited screenshots of text messages that appear to have been fabricated specifically for the purpose of supporting her narrative. He showed me printouts of documents I'd never seen before. Melissa had apparently been working with someone to create fake text message exchanges that made me look unstable and abusive. She'd practiced different versions of her tearful testimony, adjusting the details to make her story more compelling. She'd even researched which types of family dysfunction stories performed best on social media platforms. This wasn't a spontaneous reaction to a family conflict, Mr. Morrison explained. This was a calculated attempt to manipulate public sympathy, possibly as a way to pressure you into giving her money or to preemptively discredit you in case her financial fraud was discovered. I felt sick reading through the evidence of how thoroughly my daughter had planned my public humiliation. The tears in her video hadn't been genuine emotion. They'd been carefully rehearsed performance designed to destroy my reputation while positioning herself as a sympathetic victim. What does this mean for the trust? I asked. Mr. Morrison's expression grew serious. The trust language is very clear about fraudulent behavior and conduct that brings dishonor to the family name. Based on the evidence gathered by the investigation, Melissa has violated multiple provisions of the trust agreement. Under normal circumstances, this would result in immediate forfeiture of all future distributions. Under normal circumstances, the trust also includes a redemption clause. If the beneficiary acknowledges their misconduct, makes full restitution for any financial damages, publicly corrects any false statements they've made, and completes a program of community service and financial responsibility education, the trust can be reinstated after a probationary period. I looked up from the documents, trying to understand what he was telling me. So she has a chance to fix this? She does, but she would need to act quickly and completely. The trust language requires that redemption efforts begin within 30 days of the trustee becoming aware of the misconduct. After that window closes, the forfeiture becomes permanent. I thought about my daughter, about her complete inability to accept responsibility for her actions, about the way she'd laughed when I tried to explain the seriousness of credit card fraud. The idea that she would voluntarily admit to systematic fraud and public manipulation seemed almost impossible to imagine. Has she been notified about any of this? Not yet. I wanted to speak with you first, given that you're the primary victim of her fraudulent activities. The trust language gives victims of beneficiary misconduct some input into the redemption process. Mr. Morrison pulled out one final document. I need to ask you some difficult questions about your relationship with Melissa and your willingness to participate in a potential redemption process. Your answers will influence how I proceed with the trust administration. For the next hour, I answered questions about Melissa's behavior patterns, her history of manipulation and dishonesty, her response to previous attempts at accountability. I described the credit card fraud, the fake emergencies, the way she'd dismissed my attempts to set boundaries. I explained how she'd disappeared for weeks when confronted about her actions, only to return when she needed something. Mr. Morrison took careful notes, occasionally asking follow-up questions that suggested he had significant experience dealing with trust fund beneficiaries who'd lost their way. When I finished, he sat back in his chair and studied the documents spread across his desk. In my professional opinion, he said finally, your daughter exhibits classic patterns of what we call inheritance syndrome, a condition where knowledge or expectation of inherited wealth leads to entitled behavior, poor decision-making, and inability to develop normal coping mechanisms for life challenges. But she didn't know about the trust fund. She may not have known the specifics, but she clearly understood that the family had significant resources. Her grandfather owned multiple successful businesses, lived in a mansion, drove expensive cars. She spent her entire life knowing that money was available somewhere in the family system, even if she didn't know exactly how much or when she'd have access to it. That made a disturbing amount of sense. Melissa had always seemed to operate with the assumption that financial consequences weren't really permanent, that somehow money would appear when she needed it. She'd never developed the anxiety about debt or financial security that most young adults experienced, because she'd always believed that family wealth would ultimately protect her. What happens next? I asked. I'll be sending Melissa a certified letter outlining the trust violations and explaining her options for redemption. She'll have 30 days to respond with a comprehensive plan for addressing each violation. If she chooses not to respond, or if her response is inadequate, the trust will be permanently dissolved, and the assets will be distributed to the charitable organizations named as alternate beneficiaries. I've thought about $2.3 million disappearing from Melissa's future, about the reality that her grandfather's legacy would go to strangers rather than his own granddaughter. Part of me felt sad about the loss of opportunity, about the doors that money could have opened for her if she'd been able to handle it responsibly, but a larger part of me felt something that might have been relief. For months, I'd been wondering if I was overreacting to Melissa's behavior, if I was being too harsh or unsympathetic. The investigation results made it clear that her actions were far worse than I'd realized, and that my instincts about her manipulative behavior had been accurate. There's one more thing, Mr. Morrison said as I prepared to leave. The trust language includes provisions for protecting family members who've been victimized by beneficiary misconduct. If you're interested, we can discuss options for addressing the financial damages you've suffered as a result of her fraudulent activities. I hadn't thought about restitution beyond what I'd hoped Melissa would voluntarily provide. The idea that there might be formal mechanisms for recovery was both appealing and overwhelming. What would that involve? Documentation of all financial losses, including direct theft, fraudulent charges, credit damage, and related expenses. The trust can provide compensation for verified losses, effectively making you whole for the damages caused by her misconduct. I agreed to compile the financial documentation and send it to his office within the week. As I drove back to Portland, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: hope. Not hope that Melissa would suddenly become a different person, but hope that there might be consequences for her actions that didn't depend on my ability to enforce them. The certified letter was delivered to Melissa's last known address 3 days later. I knew about it because Mr. Morrison called to confirm delivery and to let me know that the 30-day countdown had officially begun. I also knew about it because within hours of receiving the letter, Melissa called me for the first time in weeks. Her voice was different than I'd ever heard it before. Not angry or manipulative or dismissive, but genuinely frightened. "Mom, I need to talk to you. Can I come over?" "That depends on whether you're ready to have an honest conversation about what's been happening." I got a letter from some lawyer in Seattle. He's saying I might lose my inheritance because of some trust violation. Do you know anything about this? I felt a moment of satisfaction that she was finally experiencing real consequences for her actions, followed immediately by the familiar maternal instinct to protect her from pain. "I know about it. I met with Mr. Morrison yesterday." "You met with him? Why didn't you tell me about this trust fund? Why didn't anyone tell me?" "Because your grandfather believed that knowledge of inherited wealth could be harmful to character development. Based on your recent behavior, it seems like he was right." There was a long pause. When she spoke again, her voice was smaller, more vulnerable than I'd heard it in years. "Mom, I'm scared. The letter says I have to admit to fraud and make restitution and do community service. It says if I don't respond properly, I lose everything." "What did you think was going to happen, Melissa? Did you think you could steal money from me and destroy my reputation without any consequences?" "I didn't steal money from you. I borrowed money and I was going to pay it back." Even in the face of losing her inheritance, she was still lying to herself about what she'd done. I felt a wave of exhaustion at the realization that fear of consequences wasn't enough to break through her self-deception. "Melissa, if you want to save your inheritance, you need to start telling the truth. To yourself and to everyone else. The lawyer has documentation of everything you've done. He knows about the credit cards, the fake emergencies, the fabricated text messages in your video. Pretending it was something else won't work anymore." "What fake emergencies? What fabricated text messages?" "Mom, I think this lawyer is lying to you." I hung up the phone. I couldn't continue the conversation because every word out of her mouth confirmed that she was still committed to her version of reality, even when confronted with evidence to the contrary. She wasn't calling because she was ready to take responsibility. She was calling because she wanted me to help her figure out how to manipulate her way out of the consequences. That evening, I received an email from Mr. Morrison with a copy of Melissa's initial response to the trust violation letter. She had hired a lawyer of her own, someone who specialized in trust and estate disputes, and they were arguing that the investigation had been conducted without proper authorization, and that the trust language was too vague to support the alleged violations. Her legal response included a counter-narrative that painted me as a vindictive mother who had manipulated the trust administrator into targeting my daughter because I was angry about normal family disagreements. She claimed that any financial irregularities were the result of authorized transactions that I was now mischaracterizing as fraud because I wanted to punish her for becoming independent. Reading her lawyer's version of events, I realized that Melissa had learned nothing from the investigation. Instead of seeing it as evidence that her behavior had serious consequences, she was treating it as another problem to be solved through manipulation and blame shifting. She was going to fight the trust violation by doubling down on the same lies she'd told in her viral video. Mr. Morrison called me that evening to discuss the response. "This isn't unusual," he said. "Trust fund beneficiaries often hire aggressive attorneys when their inheritances are threatened. The good news is that her legal strategy confirms the behavior patterns that triggered the investigation in the first place." "What do you mean?" Inability to accept responsibility, tendency to blame others for natural consequences, willingness to lie and manipulate to avoid accountability. These are exactly the character deficiencies that trust was designed to identify and discourage. Her response to the violation letter is actually strengthening the case for permanent forfeiture. I thought about my daughter, about the little girl who used to apologize profusely for spilling juice on the carpet, who would cry if she thought she'd hurt someone's feelings. Somewhere along the way, that instinctive empathy and accountability had been replaced by something harder and more self-serving. Is there any chance her legal challenge will succeed? Very unlikely. The trust language was written by some of the best estate attorneys in the country, and the investigation was conducted according to protocols that have been tested in court multiple times. But the process will take several months to resolve, and during that time she'll probably escalate her public campaign against you. He was right about that. Within days of hiring her attorney, Melissa posted a follow-up video titled, "My family is trying to steal my inheritance because I exposed their abuse." This video was even more polished than the first one, with professional lighting and editing that suggested she'd hired someone to help with production. She painted a picture of a conspiracy between me and the trust administrator to punish her for speaking out about family dysfunction. She claimed that the financial investigation was retaliation for her viral video, and that the trust violation allegations were fabricated to silence her and protect the family's reputation. She even included tearful segments about how the threat to her inheritance was forcing her to consider dropping out of graduate school and giving up her dreams for the future. The video gained even more traction than the first one, with thousands of comments expressing outrage at what appeared to be a wealthy family, using legal mechanisms to silence and control a young woman. Melissa had successfully reframed her potential loss of inherited wealth as another form of victimization, and the internet was ready to rally to her defense. But this time, I wasn't alone in dealing with the fallout. Mr. Morrison and his team had been preparing for exactly this scenario, and they had resources I didn't. Within hours of Melissa's second video going viral, a detailed response appeared on the law firm's website, outlining the facts of the trust violation case and providing documentation that contradicted her claims. The response was careful and professional, focusing on documented evidence rather than emotional appeals. It included copies of the fraudulent credit card applications, transaction records showing systematic theft, and excerpts from the fabricated text messages she'd used in her original video. Most importantly, it included a statement from the private investigator confirming that all evidence had been gathered through legitimate channels with proper legal authorization. For the first time since this nightmare began, the truth was being presented with the same level of sophistication and reach as Melissa's lies. And people were starting to pay attention to the discrepancies in her story. The comments on her second video began to shift. People were asking questions about the evidence presented by the law firm, pointing out inconsistencies in her timeline, expressing skepticism about some of her more dramatic claims. The tide of public opinion wasn't turning completely, but it was becoming more complicated and nuanced. More importantly, the people in my real life, my colleagues, my neighbors, my family, were beginning to see that there might be more to the story than they'd initially understood. My sister called to apologize for sharing Melissa's first video without getting my side of the story. The school principal reached out to discuss my return to work, acknowledging that the situation was more complex than they'd realized. It felt like I could finally breathe again, like the truth was strong enough to compete with even the most compelling lies. But I also knew that Melissa wasn't going to give up easily. She had too much at stake, and she'd already demonstrated that she was willing to destroy my life to protect her own interests. The real battle was just beginning. I spent the next few weeks working with Mr. Morrison's team to document every aspect of Melissa's fraudulent activity. We traced credit card applications back to their origins, identified patterns of behavior that showed premeditation and sophistication, compiled evidence that painted a clear picture of someone who had been systematically stealing from and lying to family members for over a year. The process was emotionally exhausting, but also oddly therapeutic. For months, I'd been questioning my own perceptions, and wondering if I was overreacting to normal young adult behavior. Having professional investigators validate my concerns and document the extent of Melissa's deception helped me trust my own instincts again. But the most important discovery came from an unexpected source. While reviewing Melissa's social media activity for evidence of premeditation, the investigators found something that changed everything. Proof that she'd known about the trust fund all along. Hidden in her direct messages was a conversation with her grandfather's former business partner, someone who had apparently let slip information about the inheritance during a family gathering 2 years earlier. The messages showed that Melissa had been researching trust law, learning about typical conditions and restrictions, even consulting with financial advisors about investment strategies for large inheritances. She'd known about the money, known about the behavioral requirements, and had been planning her approach to accessing the funds while simultaneously engaging in exactly the kind of conduct that would disqualify her from receiving them. It was as if she'd been testing the boundaries of the trust conditions, seeing how much misconduct she could get away with before facing consequences. When Mr. Morrison showed me the messages, I felt a mix of vindication and heartbreak that was difficult to process. Vindication because it proved that everything I'd suspected about her manipulative behavior was not only accurate, but worse than I'd imagined. Heartbreak because it meant my daughter had been lying to me about fundamental aspects of her life and her motivations for far longer than I'd realized. This changes the legal landscape significantly, Mr. Morrison explained. Trust violations are much more serious when the beneficiary had knowledge of the trust conditions and chose to violate them anyway. It demonstrates willful misconduct rather than simple poor judgment. What does that mean for her chances of redemption? It means the redemption clause no longer applies. The trust language includes specific provisions for situations where beneficiaries attempt to circumvent or manipulate trust conditions through deception. In those cases, forfeiture is immediate and permanent. I stared at the printed messages, thinking about all the conversations where Melissa had claimed ignorance about family finances. All the time she'd acted surprised by the consequences of her actions. She'd been playing a long game that I'd never even realized was happening. When will you notify her about this discovery? Her attorney will receive the evidence tomorrow, along with formal notification that the trust is being permanently dissolved. The assets will be distributed to the designated charities within 60 days. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the moment when Melissa would learn that her inheritance was gone forever, that her years of planning and manipulation had cost her everything she'd been working toward. Part of me felt satisfied that justice was finally being served. But part of me felt devastated for the future she'd thrown away. I thought about the good that $2.3 million could have done in the right hands. The education it could have funded, the business it could have started, the charitable work it could have supported. Instead, it would go to organizations that had no connection to our family, simply because my daughter had been unable to develop the character traits her grandfather had hoped to encourage. The call came at 6 a.m, 3 days after Melissa's attorney received the final evidence packet. Her voice was raw, like she'd been crying or screaming, or both. "How could you do this to me?" she whispered. "How could you take away my entire future?" "I didn't take anything away from you, Melissa. You did this to yourself. I'm your daughter. I'm your only child. How can you just stand by and watch them destroy my life?" For a moment, I heard echoes of the little girl she used to be, the one who would run to me for comfort when the world seemed too big and scary. But I also remembered the young woman who had systematically stolen from me, publicly humiliated me, and lied to everyone around us for months. Your life isn't destroyed. You're 22 years old with a college degree, and your whole future ahead of you. You just have to build that future through your own efforts, instead of inherited money. You don't understand. I've been planning my whole life around this inheritance. I've made commitments, investments, promises to people. Without that money, I'm nothing. If you've made financial commitments based on money you didn't have access to yet, then you've learned an important lesson about living within your means. This is all your fault. If you hadn't gone to that lawyer, if you hadn't given them information about our family business, none of this would have happened. Even after losing her inheritance, even after being confronted with documented evidence of her own misconduct, she was still trying to make me responsible for the consequences of her choices. I realized that nothing I could say would penetrate the wall of self-deception she'd built around herself. "Melissa, I love you. but I can't help you until you're ready to be honest about what you've done and why you've done it. When you're ready to take responsibility for your actions and make genuine changes in your behavior, I'll be here. But I won't enable your lies anymore." I hung up before she could respond, and then I turned off my phone. I needed time to process the end of this chapter without being pulled back into her drama. The final legal paperwork was completed 2 weeks later. Melissa's inheritance was formally dissolved, and the assets were distributed to 3 children's charities that her grandfather had supported during his lifetime. Mr. Morrison sent me a copy of the final settlement, along with a check covering all of the financial damages I'd documented. The check was for more than I'd expected, not just the direct theft and fraudulent charges, but also credit repair costs, legal fees, and compensation for the professional damage caused by her viral videos. It was enough to pay off my mortgage and still have substantial savings left over. But more valuable than the money was the sense of closure. For the first time in months, I felt like the truth had prevailed over manipulation, like there were still systems in place that could hold people accountable for their actions, regardless of how compelling their victim narrative might be. Melissa posted one final video after the trust was dissolved, a bitter rant about family betrayal and legal corruption that gained very little traction on social media. By then, enough contradictory evidence had emerged that most people had lost interest in her story. The internet had moved on to other drama, and she was left to deal with the reality of her situation without the validation of thousands of sympathetic strangers. I never watched that final video, but my sister described it as unhinged and, quote, "nothing like the person I thought I knew." That description made me sad, not because I felt sorry for Melissa, but because it confirmed that the manipulative behavior I'd been dealing with wasn't a temporary phase or a response to grief. It was who she had chosen to become. 3 months later, I returned to work at the high school. My colleagues welcomed me back with a mixture of curiosity and sympathy, and I found that my experience with Melissa had actually made me better at my job. I could recognize the warning signs of manipulation and entitlement in teenagers, and I could help parents distinguish between normal adolescent testing of boundaries and more serious character issues. I also started speaking at workshops for parents dealing with young adult children who exhibited concerning behavior patterns. Sharing my story helped other families recognize that setting boundaries and allowing consequences wasn't abandonment. It was love expressed through the courage to let someone face the reality of their choices. But the most important thing I learned was that I couldn't save someone who didn't want to be saved. I could love Melissa, support her when she was ready to make genuine changes, and hope that someday she would develop the self-awareness necessary for real growth. But I couldn't sacrifice my own well-being to enable her self-destructive patterns, and I couldn't let her manipulate me into taking responsibility for problems she had created. The trust fund was gone forever, but the door to our relationship wasn't closed. It was just conditional on her willingness to walk through it with honesty and accountability. And for the first time in years, I was okay with whatever choice she made about that. 6 months after the trust fund was dissolved, I thought I'd finally found peace. I had returned to my routine at the high school, rebuilt relationships with friends and family members who had initially believed Melissa's narrative, and even started dating someone I'd met at a community gardening workshop. Life felt stable and predictable in a way it hadn't for years. Then Melissa showed up at my workplace. I was in my office during lunch break, reviewing college application deadlines with a senior who was struggling with the essay portion, when my secretary knocked on the door. Her expression was apologetic but tense. "Mrs. Jenkins, there's someone here to see you. She says she's your daughter, but she seems upset. Should I call security?" Through the glass window of my office, I could see Melissa pacing in the main hallway, her movements sharp and agitated. She was wearing clothes I didn't recognize, expensive looking but wrinkled, like she'd been sleeping in them. Her hair was longer than I remembered, but it looked unwashed and hung in limp strands around her face. "It's okay, Janet. Send her in, but keep the door open." The student I'd been helping looked between me and the doorway with obvious curiosity. I quickly wrapped up our session and asked him to schedule a follow-up appointment, trying to keep my voice calm and professional despite the anxiety building in my chest. Melissa walked into my office like she owned it, but something was different about her usual confidence. She moved with the restless energy of someone who hadn't slept properly in days, and when she sat down across from my desk, I noticed her hands were shaking slightly. "We need to talk," she said without preamble. "This is my workplace, Melissa. If you want to have a conversation, we can schedule a time to meet somewhere private." "No, this can't wait. I've been trying to reach you for weeks, but you won't answer my calls or texts. You've blocked me on social media. You're making it impossible for me to communicate with you." I had indeed blocked her number and social media accounts after her final bitter video, partly for my own peace of mind, and partly because her messages had become increasingly erratic and demanding. But I hadn't realized she'd been trying to contact me for weeks. "If you have something important to discuss, you can email me to set up a meeting. But showing up at my job without warning isn't appropriate." "Nothing about this situation is appropriate." Her voice was rising, and I could see heads turning in the hallway outside my office. "My entire life has been destroyed because of lies you told to that lawyer. I've lost everything, and you're just going on with your perfect little life like nothing happened." I glanced toward the open door, aware that my colleagues and students could hear every word. The last thing I needed was another public scene that would undermine my professional reputation. "Lower your voice, please. There are students in the building." "I don't care about your students. I care about the fact that my own mother conspired to steal my inheritance, and then abandoned me when I needed help the most." The familiar pattern was reasserting itself. Even after months of consequences, even after losing millions of dollars due to her own documented misconduct, she was still casting herself as the victim, and me as the villain. But something about her demeanor suggested this wasn't just another manipulation attempt. She seemed genuinely desperate, in a way I hadn't seen before. "Melissa, I understand you're upset about the trust fund situation, but..." "Upset?" She laughed, but it came out harsh and broken. "I'm not upset, I'm ruined. Do you have any idea what it's like to plan your entire future around something, and then have it ripped away because your own family decides to destroy you? You destroyed yourself. The trust was dissolved because of your own actions, not because of anything I did. That's what you keep telling yourself, isn't it? That you're the innocent victim in all of this. But I know the truth about what really happened." Something in her tone made me lean forward. "What truth?" She reached into her purse and pulled out a manila envelope, thick with documents. Her hands were definitely shaking now as she spread papers across my desk. "I hired a private investigator of my own, after I lost the inheritance. I wanted to understand exactly how that lawyer got all his information, how he knew things about my finances that should have been private." I looked down at the papers she'd laid out. They appeared to be bank records and credit reports, but not the same ones Mr. Morrison had shown me. These were more recent, and they were in my name. "What am I looking at?" "You're looking at evidence that you've been stealing from me for over a year. Those credit cards you claimed I opened fraudulently? You opened them yourself and used my identity to authorize the charges. That money you said I stole from you? You transferred it out of accounts that legally belonged to me?" I stared at the documents, trying to make sense of what she was showing me. The credit card statements did show charges I recognized: groceries, utilities, gas for my car. But they were dated months before I had ever discovered Melissa's fraud. And the bank records seemed to suggest that money had been moved between accounts in patterns that didn't match my memory of events. "Melissa, none of this makes sense. These documents don't prove what you think they prove. They prove that you've been projecting your own criminal behavior onto me. You're the one with the gambling addiction. You're the one who's been stealing and lying and manipulating people. And when I started asking questions about where my college fund money had gone, you decided to destroy my credibility before I could expose you." I felt a chill run down my spine as I recognized the same sophisticated manipulation tactics she'd used in her viral videos. She was taking real documents and real financial transactions, but recontextualizing them to support a completely different narrative. The skill with which she was twisting facts to create an alternate version of reality was both impressive and terrifying. These bank records show normal household expenses paid from my own accounts. They don't show any theft or fraud. Look at the dates more carefully. Look at the account numbers. Some of these transactions were made from accounts that were set up as part of my college fund, accounts that you had access to because you were the custodian, but that legally belonged to me. I did look more carefully, and I began to see what she was pointing to. Some of the account numbers were indeed unfamiliar to me, and some of the dates preceded my discovery of her credit card fraud by several months. But I also recognized the fundamental flaw in her argument. Melissa, even if some of these transactions came from accounts that were technically in your name, they were for legitimate household expenses during a time when you were living in my house without paying rent or contributing to bills. Parents are legally allowed to use college fund money for housing and living expenses related to their child's education. I wasn't living there by choice. You manipulated me into staying by making me think I couldn't afford to live independently. You wanted access to my money, so you sabotaged my attempts to become self-sufficient. The conversation was taking on a surreal quality as she reconstructed the entire history of our relationship through the lens of her new narrative. In her version, I was the manipulative one who had been stealing from her, and her credit card fraud was actually justified retaliation for my theft of her college fund money. This is exactly what you did with the trust fund investigation, I said. You took real facts and twisted them to support a story that makes you look like the victim. But the timeline doesn't work, and the amounts don't add up, and most importantly, none of this changes the fact that you opened credit cards in my name without permission. I had permission. You gave me access to your credit information so I could help with household expenses. You told me to use your cards for groceries and gas and other things we both needed. That was partially true. During the period after her father died, when she was struggling with grief and I was trying to help her maintain some stability, I had given her access to one of my credit cards for emergency expenses. But that authorization had been for specific, limited purposes, not for the extensive personal spending I'd discovered later. I gave you access to one card for emergencies and household necessities. That's completely different from opening multiple new accounts without telling me. Is it? Or is that just what you want people to believe now that you've been caught? She was good at this. She had taken the basic facts of our situation and rearranged them to create a plausible alternative explanation that painted me as the perpetrator and her as the victim. If someone didn't know the full context, if they only had access to the documents she was showing me, her version might actually seem credible, but I did know the full context. I remembered the conversations where she'd lied about car breakdowns and job interviews. I remembered finding credit card statements for accounts I'd never opened, charges for things I'd never bought, addresses I'd never lived at. I remembered the fake text messages she'd created for her viral video, and the evidence Mr. Morrison's investigator had uncovered about her premeditation and planning. Melissa, even if everything you're saying were true, it doesn't explain the fake emergency stories, the fabricated text messages, the lies you told in your videos, or the evidence that you knew about the trust fund and were intentionally violating its conditions. Those weren't lies. Those were my attempts to get help from someone who was supposed to love and support me, but who was actually stealing from me and sabotaging my future. She had an answer for everything, a way to recontextualize every piece of evidence to support her victim narrative. It was masterful manipulation, the kind of comprehensive gaslighting that could make someone question their own memory and perception of reality. But it was also exhausting. I felt the familiar drain that came from trying to have a rational conversation with someone who was committed to an irrational version of events. She wasn't here to seek understanding or reconciliation. She was here to recruit me into her new fantasy, to get me to admit to crimes I hadn't committed so that she could justify the crimes she had. What do you want from me, Melissa? What's the point of this conversation? I want you to tell the truth. I want you to admit what you did and help me get my inheritance back. The trust can be reinstated if the beneficiary was wrongfully accused, and I have evidence now that proves I was wrongfully accused. I looked at the documents spread across my desk, at my daughter's desperate face, at the open door where my colleagues were undoubtedly listening to every word. I thought about the months of investigation, the documentation of systematic fraud, the evidence of premeditation and manipulation that had convinced a team of legal professionals to dissolve a multi-million-dollar trust. The trust can't be reinstated, Melissa. Even if your new theory were correct, which it isn't, The trust language doesn't allow for reinstatement after dissolution. Mr. Morrison explained that to you months ago. Mr. Morrison lied to me. He was working with you from the beginning to find a way to steal my money. But I have a new lawyer now, someone who understands trust law better than that old man, and she says there are legal remedies available if I can prove the original investigation was based on false information. I realized that this wasn't just a desperate attempt to get me to admit to something I hadn't done. This was the beginning of a new legal strategy, attempt to relitigate the trust dissolution by attacking the credibility of the evidence that had been used to support it. You're planning to sue me. I'm planning to get justice. If that requires legal action, then yes, I'll take legal action. The threat was clear, even if it wasn't explicitly stated. She wanted me to confess to financial crimes I hadn't committed, and if I refused, she would take me to court with her fabricated evidence and alternative narrative. She was gambling that I wouldn't want to go through the expense and stress of defending myself against false accusations. Melissa, you can file whatever lawsuits you want, but you can't change what actually happened by telling new lies about it. The evidence against you was overwhelming and independently verified. No court is going to reinstate your inheritance based on the documents you've shown me today. We'll see about that? She started gathering up her papers, her movements quick and agitated. As she stood to leave, she turned back to me with an expression I'd never seen before, something that looked almost like hatred. You know what the worst part is? I actually believed you cared about me. Even after everything that happened, even after you betrayed me and stole from me and destroyed my future, part of me still thought you were doing it because you thought it was somehow good for me. But now I know the truth. You never cared about my well-being or my character or any of the things you pretended to care about. You just wanted my money, and when you realized you couldn't get it legally, you decided to make sure I couldn't have it either. She walked out of my office without waiting for a response, leaving me sitting alone with the lingering smell of her perfume and the echo of her accusations. Through the window, I watched her get into a car I didn't recognize, an expensive sedan that made me wonder how she was affording transportation, if she was as financially ruined as she claimed. The rest of my workday was difficult to get through. Word had spread quickly about the confrontation, and I could see the curiosity and concern in my colleagues' faces as they tried to pretend they hadn't overheard everything. During my afternoon sessions with students, I found it hard to concentrate on their problems, when my mind kept replaying Melissa's accusations and trying to anticipate what her next move might be. That evening, I called Mr. Morrison to tell him about the visit, and to ask about the likelihood that Melissa's new legal strategy might succeed. It's not uncommon for trust fund beneficiaries to attempt this kind of post-dissolution challenge, he said. The documents she showed you sound like a sophisticated but ultimately flawed attempt to create reasonable doubt about the original evidence. How sophisticated? Sophisticated enough to potentially cause problems, even if it ultimately fails. Trust litigation can be expensive and time-consuming, and judges sometimes allow cases to proceed, even when the legal theories are questionable, just to ensure that all parties have been heard. I felt my stomach clench. So she could drag this out for months or years, even if she has no real chance of winning? It's possible. But there are some factors working in our favor. The original investigation was extremely thorough, and we have documentation that extends far beyond anything she could reasonably challenge. More importantly, the trust language includes provisions that make frivolous litigation very expensive for unsuccessful challengers. He explained that Robert Jenkins had anticipated the possibility that disappointed beneficiaries might attempt to challenge trust decisions through the courts, so he had included language requiring unsuccessful challengers to pay all legal costs for all parties involved in the litigation. If Melissa lost her case, she would be responsible not just for her own attorney fees, but for the legal costs of defending against her lawsuit. Given her apparent financial situation, that should be a significant deterrent to filing a frivolous challenge. What if she's not as financially ruined as she claims? What if she has access to money from sources I don't know about? That's always a possibility. Trust fund beneficiaries sometimes have resources that aren't immediately apparent to family members. But even if she has the money to fund extended litigation, she would need to find an attorney willing to take a case with very little chance of success. Over the next few weeks, I found myself waiting for the other shoe to drop. Every day I expected to receive legal papers, or to see a new viral video, or to discover that Melissa had found some other way to escalate the conflict. But nothing happened. No lawsuits were filed. No new social media campaigns appeared. No process servers showed up at my door. The silence was almost more unnerving than her threats had been. Then I got a call from my sister Rebecca, her voice tight with concern. "Dora, I think you need to know that Melissa has been calling family members, trying to get them to support her version of what happened with the trust fund." "What kind of support?" "Financial support, mostly. She's telling people that she's found evidence that you stole her inheritance money, and she needs funds to hire lawyers to get it back. She's asking for pretty significant amounts, $5,000 here, $10,000 there." I felt a familiar chill as I recognized another iteration of Melissa's manipulation tactics. She was using the family's natural inclination to help someone in need, combined with their residual uncertainty about what had really happened, to fund her legal strategy against me. "Has anyone given her money?" "Your cousin David sent her $3,000 before he called me to ask if I thought her story was credible. Uncle Bill was considering a loan before his wife talked him out of it. I think she's been working her way through the entire extended family, telling each person a slightly different version of the story." This was exactly the kind of systematic manipulation that had gotten her in trouble with the trust fund in the first place. She was treating family relationships like a resource to be exploited, using people's love and concern for her as leverage to get what she wanted. "What did you tell David?" "I told him the truth, that the trust fund investigation was legitimate, that there was extensive documentation of misconduct, and that giving her money to pursue a frivolous lawsuit was probably not going to help anyone. But I think some people are still inclined to believe her, because they can't imagine that someone so young could be as manipulative as the evidence suggests." That evening, I started making my own calls to family members, not to badmouth Melissa, but to provide context about the trust fund situation and to warn them about her fundraising campaign. Most of the conversations were awkward because discussing a family member's fraudulent behavior felt like a betrayal of loyalty, even when it was necessary for everyone's protection. But the calls also revealed something I hadn't fully understood before: how isolated I had become during the months when Melissa's viral videos had dominated the family narrative. Several relatives admitted that they had wanted to reach out to me during that time but hadn't known what to say or how to help. They had been uncertain about what was true and what wasn't, and they had chosen to stay quiet rather than risk taking the wrong side. My Aunt Carol, who had always been close to both me and Melissa, was particularly apologetic. "I should have called you when all that social media drama was happening," she said. "I knew something didn't feel right about Melissa's story, but I didn't want to make things worse by getting involved in family business." "You couldn't have known what was really going on." She was very convincing. "That's exactly what worries me now. If she was able to fool all of us once, how do we know she's not doing it again with this new story about you stealing from her?" It was a fair question, and it highlighted the fundamental problem with dealing with someone who was skilled at manipulation. Once trust was broken, every interaction became suspect, every story had to be verified, every request for help had to be evaluated, not just on its merits but on the possibility that it was part of a larger deception. Over the following days, I learned that Melissa's fundraising campaign had been more extensive than I'd initially realized. She had reached out to former teachers, family friends, even some of her father's old colleagues, spinning different versions of her victim narrative depending on what she thought would resonate with each person. To the teachers, she talked about how losing her inheritance had forced her to drop out of graduate school and abandon her dreams of becoming an educator herself. To the family friends, she focused on how the stress of the situation was affecting her mental health and making it difficult for her to maintain stable housing. To her father's colleagues, she emphasized how disappointed James would be to see his family torn apart by greed and legal maneuvering. Each story contained enough truth to be plausible, but each one also contained strategic omissions and distortions that supported her overall narrative of victimization. She was conducting what amounted to a comprehensive public relations campaign, designed to raise both money and sympathy for her cause. The most disturbing call came from Mrs. Henderson, an elderly neighbor who had known our family for over a decade. "Dora dear, I'm so sorry to bother you, but Melissa came by yesterday asking if I could help her with rent money. She said you had thrown her out of the house and that she was living in her car because she couldn't afford an apartment." "When did she come by?" "Yesterday afternoon. She looked terrible, honey. Thin and tired, like she hadn't been eating or sleeping properly. She was crying when she told me about how the family lawyers had stolen her inheritance and how you were refusing to help her because you were angry about some family disagreement." I felt sick thinking about Melissa manipulating this sweet woman who had always been kind to our family. Mrs. Henderson was on a fixed income and could barely afford her own expenses, but she was exactly the kind of person who would sacrifice her own comfort to help someone she perceived as being in need. "Did you give her money?" "I gave her $200, which is really all I could spare. But I told her I was going to call you to see if there was more help available, because it didn't seem right that a young woman should be homeless when she has family who could help." I spent 20 minutes explaining the real situation to Mrs. Henderson, showing her some of the documentation from the trust fund case, and helping her understand that Melissa's financial problems were the result of her own choices rather than family cruelty. Mrs. Henderson was shocked and embarrassed when she realized she had been manipulated, but she was also worried about what this meant for Melissa's future. "That poor girl," she said. "If she's willing to lie to people who care about her, she must be in a very dark place emotionally." It was true, and it was something I tried not to think about too much. Despite everything Melissa had done, despite the lies and manipulation and financial fraud, she was still my daughter and I still worried about her well-being. The fact that she was now scamming elderly neighbors and extended family members suggested that her situation was becoming increasingly desperate. But it also suggested that she was escalating her manipulative behavior, rather than learning from the consequences of her previous actions. Each new lie she told, each new person she deceived, was making it harder for her to find a path back to honest relationships and legitimate means of supporting herself. 3 weeks after her visit to my office, I received a registered letter from a law firm I didn't recognize. Inside was a formal notice of intent to file a civil lawsuit challenging the dissolution of the trust fund, alleging that the original investigation had been based on fabricated evidence and fraudulent testimony provided by me. The letter demanded that I preserve all documents relating to my financial relationship with Melissa and warned that destroying or concealing evidence would result in additional legal penalties. It also demanded that I provide a written statement acknowledging my role in providing false information to the trust administrators, along with a formal apology for the damage caused to Melissa's reputation and future prospects. The tone of the letter was aggressive and accusatory, clearly designed to intimidate me into settling the matter rather than defending against the lawsuit. But reading through the legal claims, I could see that they were built on the same flawed foundation that Melissa had presented during her visit to my office: creative reinterpretation of legitimate financial transactions, combined with allegations that couldn't be supported by actual evidence. I called Mr. Morrison immediately. "I've been expecting this," he said when I read him the contents of the letter. Her attorney reached out to our office last week, asking about the possibility of an out-of-court settlement. "What kind of settlement?" "They wanted us to recommend that the charitable organizations that received the trust assets consider making a voluntary payment to Melissa in exchange for her agreement not to pursue litigation. Essentially, they were asking us to help them extort money from charities by threatening frivolous lawsuits." "What did you tell them?" "I told them that the charitable organizations were protected by the same legal language that made the original trust dissolution bulletproof, and that any attempt to extract payments through litigation threats would be reported to the State Bar Association as potential attorney misconduct." Mr. Morrison explained that frivolous trust litigation was taken seriously by the courts, especially when it involved attempts to claw back assets that had already been distributed to charitable beneficiaries. Judges were generally unsympathetic to disappointed heirs who tried to use the legal system to reverse decisions that had been made according to proper procedures and documented evidence. "However," he continued, "that doesn't mean the process won't be expensive and time-consuming for everyone involved. Even a frivolous lawsuit requires a response, and trust litigation can take months or years to resolve completely. So she can still cause significant problems even if she has no chance of winning?" "Unfortunately, yes. That's often the strategy with these kinds of challenges. Make the defense so expensive and disruptive that the other parties agree to a settlement just to make the problem go away." But Mr. Morrison also explained that we had some advantages in this particular case. The original investigation had been so thorough and the evidence so well documented that defending against Melissa's challenge would be relatively straightforward. More importantly, the trust language requiring unsuccessful challengers to pay all legal costs meant that Melissa would be taking a significant financial risk by proceeding with a lawsuit she was likely to lose. The question is whether she understands that risk or whether her attorney has fully explained the potential consequences of an unsuccessful challenge. Over the next few days, I found myself oscillating between anger and sadness as I contemplated the reality that my daughter was preparing to take me to court over money that had never legally belonged to her. The lawsuit would be public record, which meant that our family conflict would once again become a matter of community knowledge and discussion. But more than that, it represented a fundamental choice on Melissa's part to escalate our conflict rather than seeking resolution or reconciliation. She was choosing to invest time, money, and energy into trying to destroy me legally, rather than using those same resources to build a productive life for herself. I thought about the conversation I'd had with my father months earlier, about the difference between helping someone and enabling them. Filing a frivolous lawsuit against me wasn't just an attack on my financial security and reputation. It was also Melissa's way of avoiding the hard work of taking responsibility for her life and making genuine changes in her behavior. As long as she could convince herself that I was the real villain in our story, she didn't have to confront the reality of her own choices and their consequences. As long as she could focus her energy on trying to prove that I had wronged her, she didn't have to do the difficult work of building authentic relationships and legitimate sources of income. The lawsuit was another form of the same avoidance behavior that had gotten her into trouble in the first place, just dressed up in legal language and backed by an attorney who was willing to take her money. But I also realized that this might be the final test of my commitment to letting Melissa face the consequences of her choices without my interference. In the past, I might have been tempted to settle the lawsuit just to avoid the stress and expense of defending against it, even if I knew her claims were false. I might have told myself that giving her some money would be easier than going through months of legal proceedings. This time, I wasn't going to take the easy way out. If Melissa wanted to learn that actions have consequences, she was going to have to learn it the hard way. And if that meant defending myself against a frivolous lawsuit, then that's what I would do. The formal lawsuit was filed 2 weeks later, and within days, it had attracted the attention of local media outlets who remembered the viral video controversy from months earlier. The story had all the elements that made for compelling news coverage: family drama, accusations of financial misconduct, and the loss of a multi-million-dollar inheritance. But this time, the media coverage was more balanced than it had been during Melissa's original viral video campaign. Reporters had access to the documentation from the trust fund investigation, and they could see that there was substantial evidence supporting the original decision to dissolve the trust. More importantly, legal experts who were interviewed for the stories expressed skepticism about the likelihood that Melissa's challenge would succeed. One article in the local newspaper included a quote from a trust and estate attorney who wasn't involved in the case, but who had reviewed the publicly available documents. Trust fund challenges are notoriously difficult to win, especially when the original decision was based on documented evidence of beneficiary misconduct. The burden of proof is on the challenger to show not just that mistakes were made, but that the entire investigation was fundamentally flawed or fraudulent. Reading that quote, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: confidence that the truth would eventually prevail over manipulation, regardless of how sophisticated or persistent the manipulation might be. But I also knew that the next phase of this conflict would test that confidence in ways I couldn't fully anticipate. Melissa had already shown that she was willing to lie about me publicly, steal from me financially, and manipulate family members into supporting her false narratives. A lawsuit would give her new opportunities to cause damage, and I would need to be prepared for whatever tactics she might employ. The battle for my reputation, my financial security, and my peace of mind was entering its most dangerous phase. But for the first time since this whole nightmare began, I felt ready to fight back with everything I had. The lawsuit officially began 6 months later, on a gray February morning, when I walked into the Multnomah County Courthouse wearing my best Navy suit and carrying a briefcase full of documents that I hoped would finally put an end to Melissa's campaign of manipulation. Mr. Morrison had flown down from Seattle with 2 associates, their confidence reassuring as we made our way through the metal detectors and up to the third-floor courtroom. Melissa was already there when we arrived, sitting at a table with her attorney, a sharp-faced woman in her 40s, who had apparently built a reputation on taking controversial family law cases. Melissa looked different than she had during our confrontation at the school. Her hair was professionally styled, her makeup was perfect, and she was wearing an expensive black dress that suggested her financial situation might not be as desperate as she'd claimed to various family members. When our eyes met across the courtroom, she didn't look away or show any sign of embarrassment or uncertainty. Instead, she stared at me with the same cold determination I'd seen in her office visit, like I was an obstacle to be overcome rather than a person she had once loved. Judge Patricia Nakamura entered the courtroom at exactly 9 o'clock. A small woman with steel gray hair and the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that suggested she had little patience for family drama disguised as legal proceedings. She reviewed the case file briefly before looking up at both legal teams. This is a challenge to the dissolution of the Robert Jenkins Educational Trust, filed by the former beneficiary Melissa Jenkins against the trust administrator and various family members, she said. Ms. Chen, you're representing the plaintiff? Melissa's attorney stood and nodded. Yes, Your Honor. We're seeking reinstatement of the trust based on evidence that the original dissolution was based on fabricated evidence and fraudulent testimony provided by family members who had financial motives to see my client disinherited. Mr. Morrison, you're representing the trust administrator and the defendant family members? Yes, Your Honor. We're prepared to demonstrate that the original dissolution was based on thoroughly documented evidence of beneficiary misconduct, and that this challenge is a frivolous attempt to relitigate a matter that was properly resolved according to the trust's own language. Judge Nakamura made some notes before continuing. I've reviewed the preliminary filings, and I have some concerns about the legal theories being advanced by the plaintiff. However, given the substantial financial interests involved, I'm willing to hear evidence from both sides before making any procedural decisions. Ms. Chen, you may present your opening argument. What followed was 90 minutes of the most sophisticated gaslighting I had ever witnessed. Melissa's attorney painted a picture of a grieving widow who had become mentally unstable after her husband's death and had begun stealing from her own daughter while projecting her own criminal behavior onto the innocent young woman she was supposed to protect. Using the same documents Melissa had shown me in my office, Ms. Chen argued that I had systematically drained accounts that belonged to Melissa, opened credit cards in her name for my own use, and then fabricated evidence of her misconduct when she began asking questions about where her money had gone. She described the trust fund investigation as a conspiracy between me and Mr. Morrison to legitimize theft that had already occurred. Your Honor, Ms. Chen said, this case represents one of the most egregious examples of financial elder abuse against a young adult that this court has ever seen. My client trusted her mother to manage her finances responsibly, and that trust was betrayed in the most calculated and devastating way possible. She even had an explanation for Melissa's viral videos and social media campaign. According to Ms. Chen, these were desperate attempts by a financially abused young woman to seek help from the only source available to her, the court of public opinion, when traditional family and legal channels had failed her. The defendant portrays my client as manipulative and dishonest, Ms. Chen continued. But the evidence will show that Ms. Jenkins was simply trying to protect herself from ongoing financial abuse by someone who had used her grief and vulnerability as weapons against her own child. It was masterfully done. If I hadn't lived through the actual events, if I hadn't seen the credit card statements and fake emergency texts and documented lies, I might have found the story compelling myself. Ms. Chen took every piece of evidence that had been used to justify the trust dissolution and recontextualized it as proof of my misconduct rather than Melissa's. When Mr. Morrison stood to present our defense, I felt my heart racing with anxiety about whether the truth would be strong enough to compete with such sophisticated manipulation. Your Honor, he began, what we have here is not a case of financial abuse, but rather a textbook example of how trust fund beneficiaries sometimes respond when their inheritance is threatened by their own misconduct. The plaintiff is asking this court to ignore documented evidence of systematic fraud, ignore video evidence of premeditation, and ignore the testimony of multiple financial institutions. all in service of a narrative that requires the court to believe that every piece of evidence gathered by professional investigators was somehow fabricated or misinterpreted. Mr. Morrison methodically walked through the evidence that had supported the original trust dissolution. He showed bank records that demonstrated a clear pattern of unauthorized credit card applications, all using Melissa's personal information, but showing spending patterns that were completely inconsistent with her lifestyle and location claims. He presented testimony from credit card company representatives who confirmed that the applications had been submitted online using IP addresses that traced to locations where Melissa had been staying, not to my house. Most damaging to Melissa's case was the digital evidence that the original investigation had uncovered. Mr. Morrison presented screenshots of the draft video scripts Melissa had written weeks before filming her viral content, showing that her emotional testimony had been carefully planned and rehearsed. He showed the fabricated text message exchanges she had created using phone apps designed to generate fake conversations for entertainment purposes. Your Honor, the plaintiff's current legal strategy is simply an extension of the same pattern of behavior that led to the trust dissolution in the first place, Mr. Morrison said. When confronted with evidence of misconduct, she doesn't acknowledge wrongdoing or attempt to make amends. Instead, she creates increasingly elaborate alternative narratives designed to cast herself as the victim and others as the perpetrators. But the most powerful moment came when Mr. Morrison presented evidence that hadn't been available during the original investigation. Working with forensic accountants, his team had traced the source of funding for Melissa's current legal case. The money wasn't coming from the family fundraising she had claimed, or from legitimate employment income, or from any other source that would be consistent with someone who had been financially devastated by losing their inheritance. Instead, the legal fees were being paid through a series of accounts that showed clear connections to online fraud schemes. Melissa had apparently been involved in what investigators described as romance scams, using dating apps and social media to build relationships with older men, and then extracting money from them through fabricated emergencies and sob stories. The plaintiff has claimed to this court that she is financially destitute as a result of losing her inheritance, Mr. Morrison said. But the evidence shows that she has actually been supporting herself through systematic fraud targeting vulnerable individuals, and that the proceeds from these activities are funding this very lawsuit. I watched Melissa's face as this evidence was presented, and for the first time since the case began, I saw her mask of confidence slip. She whispered urgently to her attorney, her face flushing red as bank records and screenshots of dating app conversations were displayed on the courtroom's projection screen. The romance scam evidence was devastating to her credibility. It showed that far from being reformed by the loss of her inheritance, she had actually escalated her fraudulent behavior, expanding from family members to strangers, and using increasingly sophisticated tactics to extract money from her victims. Judge Nakamura took a brief recess to review the new evidence, and when she returned, her expression had shifted from skeptical neutrality to obvious disapproval. Ms. Chen, she said, I'm troubled by this evidence suggesting that your client has been funding this litigation through potentially criminal activity. How do you respond to these allegations? Ms. Chen attempted to argue that the dating app evidence was irrelevant to the trust dispute and that it had been obtained through improper investigation methods. But her arguments sounded weak and desperate, especially when Mr. Morrison pointed out that the evidence had been gathered through legitimate channels and that several of Melissa's alleged victims had already filed their own police reports. Your Honor, Mr. Morrison said, this evidence is directly relevant to the central question in this case, whether the plaintiff is a credible witness whose testimony should be believed over documented evidence to the contrary. The fact that she has been systematically defrauding strangers, even while claiming to be the victim of financial abuse, demonstrates a pattern of dishonesty that goes to the heart of her allegations. Judge Nakamura spent the lunch recess reviewing the evidence privately, and when court reconvened, she was ready to render her decision. After careful consideration of the evidence presented by both parties, she began, I find that the plaintiff has failed to demonstrate any credible basis for challenging the dissolution of the Robert Jenkins Educational Trust. The evidence supporting the original dissolution was thorough, professionally gathered, and corroborated by multiple independent sources. She looked directly at Melissa as she continued. Moreover, I find that this lawsuit appears to be part of a continuing pattern of fraudulent behavior by the plaintiff, including the presentation of fabricated evidence and false testimony to this court. The romance scam evidence suggests that far from being reformed by previous consequences, the plaintiff has actually escalated her fraudulent activities. Judge Nakamura's voice grew sharper as she addressed the frivolous nature of the lawsuit itself. This case represents a waste of judicial resources and an attempt to use the court system to legitimize behavior that is not only ethically reprehensible, but potentially criminal. The trust administrator acted properly in dissolving the trust based on documented evidence of beneficiary misconduct, and the plaintiff's attempt to characterize that decision as part of a conspiracy against her is both unfounded and offensive. But the judge wasn't finished. She turned to Ms. Chen with an expression of obvious displeasure. Ms. Chen, I'm also troubled by your role in presenting what appears to be fabricated evidence to this court. The documents you submitted regarding alleged financial misconduct by the defendant appear to have been deliberately mischaracterized in ways that border on fraudulent misrepresentation. I'm referring this matter to the State Bar Association for investigation of possible attorney misconduct. Ms. Chen's face went pale as she realized that her aggressive litigation strategy had backfired, not just for her client, but for her own professional standing. She attempted to argue that she had relied on evidence provided by her client and had not independently verified its accuracy, but Judge Nakamura cut her off. Attorneys have a responsibility to ensure that evidence presented to the court is accurate and not misleading. The fact that your client may have provided you with fabricated documents does not excuse your failure to investigate their authenticity before presenting them as fact. The judge then turned to the financial consequences of the frivolous litigation. Under the trust language requiring unsuccessful challengers to pay all legal costs, Melissa was now responsible for not only her own attorney fees, but also the substantial costs incurred by Mr. Morrison's team in defending against her lawsuit. The plaintiff will be responsible for all reasonable attorney fees and costs incurred by the defendants in defending against this frivolous challenge, Judge Nakamura said. Based on the documentation provided, that amount appears to exceed $75,000. I saw Melissa's face crumple as the reality of her situation became clear. Not only had she failed to regain access to her inheritance, but she was now facing legal bills that would likely consume whatever money she had managed to accumulate through her various fraudulent schemes. But Judge Nakamura wasn't finished. She had clearly been offended by the attempt to use her courtroom to legitimize fraudulent behavior, and she wanted to ensure that there would be meaningful consequences for wasting the court's time. Furthermore, I'm ordering the plaintiff to cease all contact with the defendant family members except through formal legal channels. The evidence suggests a pattern of harassment and manipulation that extends beyond this lawsuit, and the court will not tolerate continued abuse of the legal system to facilitate such behavior. She also ordered that copies of the romance scam evidence be forwarded to the appropriate law enforcement agencies for investigation of potential criminal charges. The dating app fraud might have been funding Melissa's lawsuit, but it also constituted wire fraud and identity theft that could result in federal criminal charges. Court is adjourned, Judge Nakamura said. Ms. Jenkins, I hope you will use this experience to reflect seriously on the path your life has taken, and consider making genuine changes before you face more severe consequences. As we gathered our materials and prepared to leave the courtroom, I found myself looking at Melissa one last time. She was sitting alone at her table, her attorney having quickly packed up and left without saying goodbye. Her perfect makeup was streaked with tears, and she looked smaller and more vulnerable than I had seen her in years. For a moment, I felt the familiar maternal impulse to go to her, to offer comfort and support, despite everything that had happened. But I forced myself to remember that this was exactly the kind of enabling behavior that had contributed to her problems in the first place. She wasn't crying because she felt remorse for her actions. She was crying because she was facing consequences she couldn't manipulate her way out of. Mr. Morrison and his team were satisfied with the outcome, both because it vindicated the original trust dissolution and because it established legal precedents that would make similar frivolous challenges more difficult in the future. The $75,000 in legal fees that Melissa now owed would be collected through the same mechanisms used for any other court-ordered judgment, which meant that her assets could be garnished or seized if she refused to pay voluntarily. This should finally put an end to her ability to use the legal system to harass you, Mr. Morrison said as we walked out of the courthouse. The restraining order will prevent direct contact, and the financial judgment will consume whatever resources she might have used to fund future litigation. But more important than the legal victory was the public vindication. The court's findings would be part of the public record, which meant that anyone who had believed Melissa's viral video narrative would now have access to documented evidence that contradicted her claims. The local media coverage of the case was extensive and largely favorable to our side, particularly focusing on the judge's harsh criticism of frivolous litigation and fraudulent evidence. Over the following weeks, I received calls and messages from family members, friends, and colleagues who had been uncertain about the truth during Melissa's social media campaign. Many of them apologized for not providing more support during that difficult time, and several admitted that they had suspected there was more to the story, but hadn't known how to help. My sister Rebecca was particularly apologetic. "I should have trusted my instincts about Melissa's behavior," she said. "I've known her since she was born, and I've seen how she responds when she doesn't get her way. But the video was so convincing, and I didn't want to believe that someone in our family could be that manipulative." The conversation with Rebecca helped me understand something important about family dynamics and manipulation. Melissa's success in convincing people of her victim narrative hadn't been based just on her acting ability or video production skills. It had been based on people's natural reluctance to believe that someone they loved could be systematically dishonest, combined with their desire to avoid taking sides in what appeared to be a family conflict. But the court case had provided something that emotional appeals couldn't: objective evidence evaluated by an impartial third party. Judge Nakamura's findings carried weight, not because of any personal relationship or family loyalty, but because they were based on documented facts and professional investigation. 3 months after the court case ended, I received an unexpected phone call from Detective Sarah Martinez with the Portland Police Bureau's Financial Crimes Unit. She explained that they had been investigating the romance scam evidence that had emerged during the lawsuit, and that their investigation had uncovered a much more extensive pattern of fraud than anyone had initially realized. "We've identified at least 12 victims over the past 18 months, Detective Martinez said. The total amount stolen appears to exceed $40,000, and some of the victims are elderly individuals living on fixed incomes who can't afford to lose the money they gave her." The detective wanted to interview me about Melissa's behavior patterns and financial history, partly to understand how her fraud schemes had developed, and partly to gather evidence for the criminal charges they were preparing. She explained that the romance scam evidence from the lawsuit had provided them with digital trails and victim testimonies that made prosecution viable. "One of the things we're trying to understand is whether this behavior escalated gradually or whether it was always present but hidden," Detective Martinez said. "Based on your experience with her, do you think she was always capable of this level of systematic deception?" It was a difficult question to answer honestly. Part of me wanted to believe that the Melissa who had defrauded strangers was a different person than the daughter I had raised, that grief or stress or mental illness had transformed her into someone unrecognizable. But looking back at the patterns of behavior I had documented over the years, I had to admit that the capacity for manipulation had been there long before the trust fund situation. "I think she's always been very good at reading people and telling them what they want to hear," I said. What changed was the sophistication of her methods and the willingness to target strangers instead of just family members. Detective Martinez explained that they were also investigating the attorney who had represented Melissa in the trust case. The fabricated evidence that had been presented to the court, combined with the apparent failure to investigate the source of the legal fees, suggested possible violations of professional conduct rules that could result in disciplinary action or even disbarment. "We take attorney misconduct very seriously, especially when it involves the presentation of false evidence to the court," she said. "If Ms. Chen knew or should have known that the documents she submitted were fabricated, she could face both professional discipline and criminal charges." The criminal investigation moved slowly, as these cases often do, but over the following months, I received periodic updates about its progress. Several of Melissa's romance scam victims had agreed to testify at trial, And the digital evidence from her dating app activities provided a clear timeline of fraudulent activity that extended well beyond what had been revealed during the trust litigation. Meanwhile, Melissa herself had seemingly disappeared. The last known address the court had for her was an apartment that she had abandoned shortly after the lawsuit ended, apparently without paying rent or utilities for the final 2 months. Attempts to serve her with the criminal charges had been unsuccessful, and there was some speculation that she might have left the state to avoid prosecution. But she resurfaced 6 months later in the most predictable way possible, with another viral video. This time, the video was titled, "How the Legal System Failed Me: A Young Woman's Fight Against Family Corruption." It was filmed in what appeared to be a different city, possibly California, based on the visible palm trees, and Melissa looked different again. Her hair was a different color, her style of dress had changed, and she was using a slightly different version of her name in the video description. In this new video, she presented herself as a whistleblower who had been targeted by powerful family interests because she had tried to expose financial corruption. She described the court case as a sham proceeding where evidence had been suppressed and witnesses had been intimidated. She claimed that the romance scam allegations were fabricated by investigators who were working for the family to discredit her testimony. But this video didn't gain the same traction as her earlier content. The comments section was full of people who had followed the story from the beginning and who pointed out inconsistencies in her latest narrative. Several comments included links to news articles about the court case, which provided detailed information about the evidence that had been presented and the judge's findings. More importantly, the platforms where she posted the video quickly received takedown requests from several of her romance scam victims, who argued that the content constituted continued harassment and defamation. Within a week, the video had been removed from most major social media sites, and Melissa's accounts had been suspended or banned for violating community standards. Detective Martinez called to let me know that the new video had actually helped their investigation by providing evidence of Melissa's current location and activities. They were working with law enforcement in California to locate and arrest her on the outstanding warrant for wire fraud and identity theft. The video also demonstrates continued fraudulent behavior, Detective Martinez explained. She's making false statements about the court case and the evidence, which could support additional charges for perjury or obstruction of justice. 2 weeks later, Melissa was arrested at a coffee shop in San Diego, apparently while filming another video about her ongoing legal troubles. The arrest was captured by security cameras and later leaked to social media, showing her being handcuffed while crying and claiming that she was being persecuted for trying to expose the truth about family corruption. But by then, very few people were still willing to believe her victim narrative. The evidence from the court case, combined with the criminal charges and the pattern of lies that had been documented over several years, had thoroughly discredited her claims of innocence or victimization. The criminal trial took place 8 months later, and I was called to testify about Melissa's history of fraudulent behavior and manipulation tactics. It was emotionally difficult to sit in a witness stand and describe my own daughter's crimes to a jury, but I knew that the victims of her romance scams deserved justice, and that she needed to face meaningful consequences for her actions. Melissa's defense attorney tried to argue that she was mentally ill and not responsible for her actions, but the prosecution presented evidence that her fraud schemes had been carefully planned and executed with full awareness of their illegality. The fake dating profiles, the fabricated emergency stories, the systematic targeting of vulnerable individuals, all of it demonstrated sophistication and premeditation that was inconsistent with claims of diminished capacity. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before finding her guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced her to 3 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. She was also ordered to pay full restitution to all of her victims, which totaled more than $60,000 when combined with the legal fees from the civil case. At the sentencing hearing, Melissa was given the opportunity to address the court and her victims. I hoped that facing the reality of prison time might finally break through her wall of self-deception and lead to some genuine acknowledgement of responsibility. Instead, she used the time to deliver a 15-minute speech about how she was the real victim of a coordinated campaign by powerful family interests and corrupt law enforcement officials. She claimed that the evidence against her had been fabricated and that the victims who testified against her had been paid to lie about their experiences. Even while being sentenced to federal prison, even after losing her inheritance and her freedom and her reputation, she was still committed to the same patterns of blame-shifting and manipulation that had defined her behavior for years. Judge William Torres, who had presided over the criminal trial, was clearly unimpressed by her performance. "Ms. Jenkins," he said, "you have shown no remorse for your crimes and no empathy for your victims. Even now, faced with overwhelming evidence of your guilt, you continue to blame others for the natural consequences of your own choices. This pattern of behavior suggests that you pose a continuing danger to the community, and that significant incarceration is necessary to protect potential future victims." As Melissa was led away in handcuffs to begin her prison sentence, I felt a complex mix of emotions that I'm still trying to process. Relief that her ability to hurt other people had finally been constrained by the legal system. Sadness that it had taken criminal prosecution to achieve what years of family intervention had failed to accomplish. And uncertainty about what, if anything, our relationship might look like when she was eventually released. But mostly, I felt something that had been missing from my life for years: peace. The constant anxiety about what Melissa might do next, the perpetual vigilance required to protect myself and others from her manipulation, the exhausting cycle of crisis and confrontation, all of it was finally over. For the first time since her father died, I could make plans for my future without worrying about how those plans might be disrupted by her latest scheme or emergency or victim narrative. I could rebuild relationships with family members without wondering whether she was working behind the scenes to turn them against me. I could go to work and come home and live my life without constantly looking over my shoulder. The trust fund that her grandfather had established to encourage good character and responsible behavior had served its purpose, just not in the way anyone had expected. Instead of rewarding positive development, it had revealed the extent of Melissa's character deficiencies and provided the resources necessary to document them thoroughly. The inheritance she had lost was ultimately much less valuable than the truth that had been established about her behavior patterns. As I write this, Melissa has been in prison for 14 months, with about 18 months remaining on her sentence. I haven't visited her or had any direct contact since her sentencing, partly because of the court-ordered restraining order, and partly because I don't believe she's ready for honest conversation about what happened between us. But I have been working with a therapist who specializes in family relationships affected by manipulation and fraud, and I've learned some important things about the difference between love and enabling. Loving someone doesn't mean accepting their lies or protecting them from consequences. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is to let someone face the full reality of their choices, even when that reality is painful. I've also learned that I wasn't responsible for Melissa's transformation into someone capable of systematic fraud and manipulation. The choices she made as an adult were her own, regardless of what factors from her childhood or family environment might have contributed to her development. I can acknowledge mistakes I made as a parent without accepting responsibility for crimes she committed as an adult. The other victims of her romance scams have formed an informal support group, and several of them have reached out to thank me for testifying at her trial. Many of them are elderly individuals who lost significant portions of their retirement savings to her fake emergency stories, and they've told me that seeing her held accountable has helped them begin to heal from the financial and emotional trauma she caused. One of her victims, a 78-year-old widower named Frank, sent me a letter that I keep on my desk as a reminder of why it was important to see the prosecution through to the end. "I know she's your daughter, and this must be painful for you," he wrote. "But she took $8,000 from me that I had been saving to help pay for my granddaughter's college expenses. More than the money, she took my ability to trust people and my confidence in my own judgment. Seeing her convicted and sentenced has given me back some faith that there are consequences for people who prey on others' kindness." Last month, I received a letter from Melissa for the first time since her sentencing. It was forwarded through her prison's mail system, carefully screened by corrections officials to ensure it didn't violate the restraining order or contain threats or manipulative content. The letter was 3 pages long, written in the careful handwriting I remembered from her childhood homework assignments. In it, she claimed to have undergone a spiritual transformation during her incarceration, and to finally understand the harm her actions had caused to me and to her other victims. She apologized for the lies she had told, acknowledged that the trust fund dissolution had been justified by her own misconduct, and expressed regret for the pain she had caused to family members and strangers alike. She asked for my forgiveness and for the opportunity to rebuild our relationship when she was released from prison. It was exactly the kind of letter I had hoped to receive for years, the acknowledgement of responsibility and expression of remorse that had been missing from every previous conversation we'd had about her behavior. But reading it, I felt more sadness than relief. The timing was too convenient, the language too carefully crafted, the emotional appeals too precisely targeted to my known vulnerabilities. After years of experience with her manipulation tactics, I couldn't help but wonder whether this apparent transformation was genuine, or whether it was simply the latest version of telling me what she thought I wanted to hear. I showed the letter to my therapist, who helped me understand that my skepticism was both natural and appropriate, given the history of our relationship. She explained that genuine transformation requires consistent demonstration over time, not just words on paper written from a prison cell. People can change, she said, but they have to earn back trust through actions, not just promises. And you have the right to protect yourself from further manipulation, even if there's a chance that her remorse is genuine. I haven't responded to Melissa's letter yet, and I'm not sure if or when I will. Part of me hopes that her transformation is real, that prison has finally provided the consequences severe enough to break through her pattern of self-deception and blame-shifting. But part of me knows that I've been hoping for that kind of change for years, and that hope has been used against me more than once. What I do know is that I'm no longer willing to sacrifice my own well-being to enable someone else's dysfunction, even if that someone is my own daughter. I've learned that setting boundaries isn't cruel or unloving. It's necessary for maintaining healthy relationships and protecting yourself from people who view your kindness as weakness to be exploited. If Melissa has truly changed, she'll demonstrate that through consistent, responsible behavior over months and years, not through a single letter written when she has everything to gain from appearing reformed. If she hasn't changed, then maintaining distance will protect both of us from repeating the destructive patterns that led to her imprisonment. Either way, I'm finally free from the burden of trying to save someone who didn't want to be saved. I can live my life, build healthy relationships, and make plans for the future without constantly wondering when the next crisis or manipulation or emergency will disrupt everything I've worked to create. The trust fund is gone forever, dissolved and distributed to charities that will use the money to help people who genuinely need assistance. Melissa's inheritance is gone forever too, the consequence of choices she made despite having every opportunity to choose differently. But the most important thing that was lost and found in this whole process wasn't money or property or legal judgments. It was the truth about what had really happened in our family, and the recognition that love without boundaries isn't actually love at all. It's enabling disguised as devotion. Today, I'm living the life I should have been living all along. One where my kindness isn't mistaken for weakness, where my love isn't exploited as leverage, and where the consequences of other people's choices belong to them, not to me. And for the first time in years, that feels like enough. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.